Does using documentation as a developer make me look unprofessional? I'm a junior developer and working every other 3 months in a software development company as part of my corporate studies. Even though I've been programming for almost 1 year, 3 by 3 months work experience plus side projects, I quite often have to check the documentation and/or Stack Overflow during my workday. I fear this makes me look unprofessional or more inexperienced than I actually am. I'm quite comfortable designing and building software, but often have to search for terms like PHP, JavaScript function that does XYZ. In most cases I should already know this, as I have this already used before but want to double check before making mistakes. The reason for asking this question is that I get kind of mocked for using Stack Overflow documentation so frequently, which makes others and myself doubt my abilities. For me it's a natural part to work more efficiently and become more aware of the language. Someone once told me something like, "A surgeon cannot read his books every time he has to operate on a patient." Which is in my opinion nonsense. I'm also asking for the future, e.g. if I have to write code during an interview for another job, I guess you shouldn't use the documentation.
Don't worry, you are a professional, and you are acting like one. Professionals use all resources available to get the job done, including documentation, code written by others, libraries, help from experts, etc. It's not unprofessional to need to consult an external resource. In fact, it would be unprofessional to not use documentation if you aren't sure how something works. Does your level of reliance on documentation show inexperience? Sure, to a certain extent. But you are inexperienced. After only a few months on the job, you won't know as much as someone with many years of experience. That's just a fact, and no one is likely to hold it against you. However, even developers with 20 years of experience will be checking the documentation for some things. This is always part of a developer's toolkit. Programming tests are a slightly different thing. Since they are designed to assess your own knowledge and ability, you will often have to complete them without documentation. This isn't because documentation is bad, it's just that, in the artificial environment of a brief test that attempts to assess your overall capability, external resources may confuse that picture. However, typical programming tests are conceptual in nature. They are typically about your ability to create an algorithm, design a solution to a problem, and follow good coding practices. These are not things you would get from documentation anyway. Getting an occasional minor syntax detail wrong is not likely to affect your assessment much.
Does using documentation as a developer make me look unprofessional? No, it actually means opposite. As you are not disturbing your seniors by asking question which one can easily find on internet or through documentation. Most of us devs can't remember thousands of lines of documentations. All the times, especially when we switch between technologies. I'm also asking for the future. E.g. if I have to write code during an interview for another job, I guess you shouldn't use the documentation. Most reasonable companies would like to test the logic, structure you come up in a coding test. Not that much about syntax.
Someone once told me something like, "A surgeon cannot read his books every time he has to operate on a patient." Whoever told you that doesn't know how surgery works. Unless it's a very common procedure the surgeon has practiced 100 times, the good ones spend a great deal of time studying before every patient they see. They also spend many years in medical school studying a subject that hasn't changed much in several thousand years. You are in your first year in an industry where new ways of doing things are being invented every week. You are inexperienced, so it should be expected that you have to look things up frequently. As long as you have the foundations to know whether the solutions you find actually solve your problem and that you learn from the experience, there is nothing wrong with this. I have been a software engineer for 15 years and still need to look things up almost every day. A professional uses every resource they have available to get the job done.
Professionalism and knowledge are two completely different things. Looking up things from third-party sources does mean you lack knowledge, not lack of professionalism. Lacking knowledge is a topic for itself, but overall there is no person knowing everything. If you know about your lack of knowledge and handle it by looking things up from third-party sources, this means you have a professional strategy to solve your specific problem of lacking knowledge. Not looking things up while not knowing that stuff is unprofessional, but this is not your case. Further reading on an effect which contrasts your strategy of using documentation, the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Does using documentation as a developer make me look unprofessional? No. Remembering minute arbitrary details is a waste of your resources. You would have to remember a lot of those both in PHP, which lacks a bit on consistency side, and in web development in general, if you get familiar with several languages and a dozen frameworks. I get mocked for using documentation so frequently, which makes doubting my abilities. This may be not the most efficient way to solve your tasks. Do you use any IDE? Do your colleagues use any? Because looking up those minute details can be delegated to IDE's autocomplete feature. Using autocomplete is more efficient than switching your attention to browser and searching for an answer there. If your colleagues use their IDE's autocomplete and you use Google instead, then that could look unprofessional, not because you consult docs but because you are doing it inefficiently. If your colleagues rely on their memory and you rely on autocomplete, you'll be able to outperform them in tasks that use some framework none of you are familiar with, which is not that rare in web. Master your tools and show performance, that's professional.